Hi, and thank you for joining me for another lecture. And friends, today I want to discuss head covering for Jewish women. Basically, what are the actual laws and where do we derive them from? And ultimately, are they mandatory? And I'll also try to discuss what was done in the past and what is currently done today. Now, the root of this whole issue begins with one word, and that's erva, literally nakedness, or in our case, sensual attractiveness. And this, friends, is the reason women have to cover their hair, hands down. Mainly because this is the only inyan that Chazal actually derived from Torah Shebiktav. And everything else, or the other obligations to cover one's head, are typically seen as extensions to this particular sugya. And what was ultimately derived from Torah? Because yes, I'll tell you that there is no direct mitzvah in the Taryag mitzvot that compels a woman to cover, with the exception of the mitzvah of lo tasur, of not straying from the rulings of the court, which I'll cover in a minute. And actually, friends, one principle that we must learn is that something doesn't have to be found in the actual 613 mitzvot in order to have the status of deriving from the Torah, which is something you hear from women who strive not to cover, right? Statements like, which direct commandment am I violating by not covering? So you're probably wondering, where does the notion of covering one's hair appear in Torah? Well, plainly, it's actually through the story regarding the sotah that we learn that not only was it a practice that existed from the time of Moses, but this story actually sheds light on the importance that women and society placed on an uncovered head of hair, not to mention the sensical notion regarding the dynamics of sexual attraction. And what is also true, friends, is that the story of the sotah is not enough for someone alone to then say that it is clear, according to the Torah, that Hashem wants women to cover. In other words, this is why the court of judges, the Beit Din Hagadol, were developed by the Almighty in the first place, for there ultimately to be a uniform and unified understanding of Jewish practical law. However, friends, this issue, although may be easy to understand in terms of whether it's binding or not, is for sure a bit difficult to explain in terms of what does Jewish law consider a covering, and which covering is derived from a Torah level and which one is from a rabbinic level, and last, which one is just left up to local custom. Now, first and foremost, you need to understand that, like we said, that the halachot regarding coverings one head or hair, although slightly appearing in scripture, barely are really understood as ultimately rabbinic commands, which is why it is known as Da'at Moshe, and literally not a mitzvah deoraita or halacha le Moshe Sinai. And friends, don't let the notion of it being a rabbinic command make you feel that it's in some way new and not binding. In other words, rabbinic rulings could have been established as far back as to when the Jews were in the wilderness by the court. However, like we said, that in Torah you will never find this actual mitzvah enumerated in the 613 mitzvot. And although this command was made mandatory by the great court of 70 judges, the Sanhedrin, and not Hashem himself, this does not mean that it's not binding or not obligatory to us today. Actually, the Torah is very clear that the Almighty himself instituted and authorized this court to develop, as it states, Torot, to help the Jewish people to keep Torah in a healthy, unified manner. As a matter of fact, it goes on telling us regarding this court, as it states in Deuteronomy 17, that we are not to stray from the right or to the left from the instructions that they give us. And then it says that by disobeying them, we would be disobeying the Almighty himself. Now, I know that many out there already know this, but you would actually be surprised on how many don't. Not because they don't care, but because no one has taken the time to explain the foundations of the oral and rabbinic law to them. Now, one other thing most people don't know is that this court, Chazal, could not tell you what to believe in, and they never had the authority to add to the narrative of the Torah. No, they only had the authority to make Torah life livable and applicable throughout our generations by either establishing gezerot, fences, or takanot, edicts, and even minhagim, as I'll explain later, to ultimately keep us progressing in Torah. Now, although their instructions were sanctioned by the Torah, we are always careful to always call their rulings rabbinic and not Torah, lest we fall into the grave sin of Baal Tosif, of adding to the Torah. For example, a difference between the two is that rabbinic laws can be modified and even abolished by the court itself, by Chazal, while Torah law can never be permanently abolished or modified. However, this, as it states in Parashat Shoftim and many other parashiot, that the individuals who sat on this court had two qualities that till today keep these laws, these rabbinic laws, from being abolished or even altered. For one, we see that the Almighty himself instructs Moses to ordain them for service, which tells us that this is a position that must be instituted by a transitional authority. In other words, someone who was already ordained could ordain someone else, and on, known as smicha. And you must know that this was a line that has been lost and really can't be recreated today. Although the Rambam himself, a dat yachid, as an FYI in this area, does give a formula for their reformation. But anyways, secondly, it clearly states in the same parak that they shall judge from the place that Hashem himself would choose, which, as we know, was ultimately Yerushalayim, on the Temple Mount, which is why we know that as long as the temple stood, the great Sanhedrin ruled from the temple. And yes, for my Messianic listeners out there, this notion of erva would have been where Paul originally bases his understanding that all women must cover their hair in the Christian Bible. Mainly because he himself was a Jew who grew up in a society controlled by the court's rulings, and which is why in the same Christian Bible we see them celebrating festivals like Purim and Chanukah, which again were holidays instituted into obligatory law by the Sanhedrin. Now, just like Paul, many even today in the Jewish world have developed other supposed spiritual reasons to cover up. But remember, it all derives off of the notion of nakedness, of erva, which derives from the Sota narrative. Now, Paul's reasoning in the Christian Bible about it being tied into a form of humility also appears in many Jewish sources. For example, the Rambam in Hilchot Tefillah mentions the pious act of always having one's head covered as it was done by the students of the sages. And here, he really doesn't state that this was an act only for men to do, or on how even the word for head covering today, at least regarding men, is yarmulke, which comes from yirat hamalkut, a fear of the Almighty's kingship, or how it's taught in the Gemara that children would wear head coverings to inspire yirat shamayim, a fear of heaven, from an early age. But regardless, friends, like we said, the original source for women covering their hair, which at least according to the literal text of the Torah, was nakedness, which was a nakedness not just felt by the woman herself, but at least according to the narrative, also frowned upon as disgraceful by others. So with this lecture, I'm going to start out quickly by saying that if you are a woman who believes in Torah Shebektav and Torah Shebal Peh, you should be covering your hair. And I'll explain why. First, what is considered erva in Judaism? Well, erva has been defined to include a woman's thighs, her hair, her chest, a sexy voice, etc. All these have the status of what has become known as erva. So far, it doesn't take much to realize that what the rabbis or Chazal defined as erva was solely built off of a woman's sensual attractiveness. And like we said, that yes, the issue of head covering, although built off of the narrative of the Sota, is still virtually a 100% rabbinic principle and ultimately halakha. And friends, so far, I'm trying to help you distinguish between oral rabbinic law and Torah law. So I can now explain what makes them both important and unique in their own way. In other words, rabbinic decrees, unlike Torah law, always had to be built off of logic, which is why the Sanhedrin was composed of 71 of Israel's wisest Torah scholars, who in turn had to vote on any given issue. So we know that if the Torah gave a law which the text itself gave no reason for, no one would argue with the Creator as to whether that law is justified to be kept or not. Why? Because as followers of Torah, we have faith that our Creator does not make mistakes. While at the same time, we know that errors and mistakes do exist when fallible individuals are involved. And yes, Chazal, our sages, made mistakes, and anyone who tells you anything different does not know Jewish law very well. As a matter of fact, the Talmud itself has a tractate called Horayot, which depicts the errors made by the Sanhedrin by Chazal and what sacrifice actually had to be brought when those errors were made. And this also appears in Hilchot Shegagot of the Rambam. Now, the reason I'm bringing down these ideas is not to confuse, but to help you understand this idea from its foundation, mainly because many people will try and have tried to use any argument possible to justify women not covering their hair nowadays, from it's not biblical to that it was just left up to local custom. And if one is sincerely searching for what is true, you might get frustrated to the point that you might decide not to cover up at all, just because of all the confusion out there, which is why I'm going to try to be very precise and very thorough in this lecture for clarity's sake. Now, one argument made by many liberal Orthodox Jews is that the whole prohibition of exposing one's hair or head was only left up to local custom. And being that this is not the custom today, there is no need to continue doing so. The whole reason this argument is made is based on the notion that one reason for covering one's hair in halakha is for what is known as Dat Moshe, or the faith, custom, or law of Moshe, as it states in Hilchot Ishut. יוצא לשוק או למבוי מפולש, וראשה פרוע ואין עליך רדיד כשאר הנשים, אף על פי ששרה מכוסה במטפחת. That this prohibition includes ladies going into the marketplace without having a head fully covered, as with a tichel or a handkerchief, and not with a veil like all other women. So here the Rambam explains how a woman violates the faith or custom of Israel. He states, again, that if the woman fails to wear a veil to cover her hair, not her head, which is called a radid, with this she has violated Da'at Yehudit. This is apart from a head covering, which he calls the mitpachat. And this is something that many have failed to understand when teaching this topic, that there is actually a difference between covering your head and covering your hair in Judaism. In other words, we're talking about two different head coverings, and this is how it's brought down in the Shulchan Aruch and even in the Bir Halacha. As a matter of fact, in the previous halacha, it states that the following are the actions for which a woman is considered to have violated Dat Moshe, the custom of Moses. And the first one is going out to the marketplace with her hair, Rosha, on her head, uncovered. Yotza beshuk us'ar Rosha galui. So here we see there's another category. Now it's true that they both mention hair, but rather, at least according to Dat Yehudit, according to the Redid, he emphasizes hair, while here the head is more emphasized. So this violation is deemed as one violating Dat Moshe, a violation whose initial warning came from Torah, clearly different than the later violation that we mentioned that was Dat Yehudit. And also, we know, according to the Sota story, that she initially didn't have all her hair covered, that her covering was actually a basket, something that in some way was see-through, which again emphasizes the notion that this is regarding a head covering and not technically something that covers your whole hair like a redid does. And another word for redid is veil. And again, why is it called Da'at Moshe or not something else like Mitzvah Deoraita or Halachale Moshe Misinai? Because, well, as we said earlier, the Torah does not bring it down as a law, but instead clearly as a practice or custom that seems to have been instituted by Moses himself, to the point that the practice of at least uncovering the head of the Sotah made its way into an actual mitzvah, the mitzvah pertaining to the whole Sotah ordeal. And yes, even the Gemara itself in this Sugya says that Rabbi Yishmael calls it Midoraita, from the Torah. Okay? Still with me so far? So again, remember, if someone goes out with her head uncovered, at least according to the story of the Sota, which her hair was not completely covered, but her head was, it is a violation of Da'at Moshe. And the other is going out with her hair uncovered, which is a violation of Da'at Yehudit, literally a law of Israel, which, like we said, still had the obligatory status of even Torah law because of lo tasur, lest someone think that it was disposable in some way. And again, lo tasur means not to stray. In other words, not to stray from the rulings of the great court, the court established by the Almighty himself. Now again, the understanding is that Dat Moshe, at least according to this sugya in Masechet Ketubot, means a law or custom that derived somehow from the Torah, and Dat Yehudit was a custom that, once it was accepted by the majority of Israel, was later made binding by the court. Because yes, the court was also responsible in legislating customs in Israel. And the problem really arose in the area of the Achronim, when there was no Sanhedrin, and the notion of custom, of Minhag, just meant something your community did, but really had no legal binding authority in halakha attached to it, like Lag BaOmer, Ushpizin, etc. So this made later rabbis begin understanding Chazal and Minhagim under the same light that they viewed their own unauthorized additions. Basically, as something that could change and come and go without any halachic ramifications attached to them. And friends, you must know that the new liberal understanding that Da'at Yehudit is a practice only left up to local custom appears nowhere, anywhere. Now, it is also true that a clear definition also does not exist stating that the actual phrase Da'at Yehudit means binding unchangeable halacha, although the Rambam in his Hagdama to his Perush HaMishnayot does state that da'at means a binding minhag made into halacha by the court. So really, that and understanding this whole sugya in context should really seal the issue for you. Not to mention that for things to be solely left up to local custom, the halacha itself would have to have specified this clause, which is something that the Gemara, the Mishnah, both the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam fails to mention regarding this halacha, the notion that it was left up to local custom. And yes, they all lived in different times and different societies and still taught this as their halacha, not to mention that it was also considered halacha in the Ashkenazi Jewish world. So much for it being left up to local custom, which is why this was only a modern liberal understanding to this halacha. In other words, every Jewish community understood this law as binding on all women, and only during the age of the Achronim did you begin to see a differing in opinion. And yes, the Achronim have had a great reputation of suiting halacha to fit their local societies instead of suiting their societies to fit halacha, to the point that the Aruch HaShulchan considers this an actual mitzvah, as he teaches that he believes that we have an obligation to justify the practices of Jewish communities we live in. I mean, can you imagine this? And this is basically the basis for the liberal modern Orthodox world choosing not to cover. Something very, very idiotic in my opinion. And what's even more morally idiotic is in how so many future rabbis took the same approach. And friends, what really solidifies the notion that Da'at Yehudit is part of unchangeable halacha, again, with the lack of another Sanhedrin of greater wisdom and greater number, which would be the only way to alter a halakha, is the other prohibitions that are enumerated also as Da'at Yehudit in the same halakha. For example, it states that under the same clause of Da'at Yehudit, it is forbidden for a woman to spin wool with a rose on her face or on her forehead or on her cheek like immodest Gentile women do, or to spin in the marketplace and show her forearms to men, or to flirt frivolously with young men, or to demand sexual intimacy from her husband in a loud voice until her neighbors hear her talking about their intimate affairs, or to curse her husband's father in her husband's presence. All these are also considered Da'at Yehudit. So who in their right mind would assume that all these prohibitions would also be left up to local custom? And not to mention that the halakha clearly teaches that a woman loses her ketubah if she does any of these. In other words, that she can be divorced without any financial compensation. One of the worst punishments a woman could receive in the Jewish world, at least at that time. Really, don't you think that's a little bit of overkill for something that was supposedly left up to local custom? And this idea may seem new for many, but yes, even minhagim had to be instituted by the Sanhedrin, unless, of course, specifically stated that it was only something left up to local custom. And then many will blindly quote Minhag Yisrael Torachi, Minhag Avotenu Torachi, Minhag Yisrael Dinchu, Minhag Kehalacha, as to somehow try to help the argument for a custom being or becoming an obligation, when what they actually do is weaken the halachic concept of a minhag to something that can as easily be abolished as quickly as it was created. And this is really derived of a confusion within the idea of customs or minhagim. In other words, with the micro and macro minhagim that exist in Jewish life today. Because, friends, in Judaism we do have the notion of the micro minhag. In other words, something personal you choose to take upon yourself, or something that your community chose to take upon itself. Which is why today you have Hasidic minhagim, Sephardi, Ashkenazi minhagim, all different types, all left up to or even derived from where that Jewish community originated from. And yes, sometimes these communal minhagim at the time of the Beit Din HaGadol, the time of Chazal, in other words, almost 2,000 years ago, many of these customs did spread and were adopted and made law by the great Sanhedrin. But this in no way should make us think that every time we hear the word minhag or custom, that this means that it's automatically left up to local practice or acceptance, especially when the halakha clearly states that it was adopted by the daughters of Israel and not a specific community. Which is why, friends, it was only the Radid that was Da'at Yisrael, which was the extra covering, not the one that the Rambam refers to as Da'at Moshe, which was the head covering that also covered the hair, but did not go further to include the neck and even the chest. And friends, this is the problem that arises when people build halakha off of Achronim and not Tanaim or Amoraim, or in this case, straight from Rishonim. In other words, friends, because the Shulchan Aruch does not mention the Da'at Moshe aspect of the halakha, everyone decided to follow his later interpretation, and worse, act like a biblical correlation was ever made, when the Gemara in the actual Sugya clearly states that it was Midoraita, and Rashi, the Rif, and countless others taught this in the same manner. And friends, regarding customs, how do we know that even Minhagim were instituted by the court? And when I mean instituted by the court, I mean made binding from a rabbinic perspective, i.e. something we cannot abolish till we have another court. Well, it states in the first parak of Chilchot Mamrim, Beit Din Hagadol Shebe Yerushalayim Echem Iker Torah Shebal Peh. It says that the great court in Yerushalayim, they are the root of the oral law. And then it states of what comes from them and what's binding to adhere to. It states in the third parak. It says, Hagezarot veHatakanot veHaminhagot, edict, decrees, and custom. All these regarded as oral law, unchangeable when there is no court. And this is why regarding Dat Yehudit, the Rambam in Hilchot Ishut Perek Chaf Dalet states, Ve'ezu hi Dat Yehudit, hu minhag hatzniut, shenahagu benot Yisrael. What is meant by the Jewish faith? The customs of modesty that Jewish women practice. But regardless, all this is said only about their hair covering, that halakha calls the radid, because like we said earlier, that the mitbachat, the tichel, is dat Moshe. So those who believe, because they translate dat Yehudit, limited to only local custom, that this in some way frees modern women from having to cover their heads, should really study the sugya in its entirety and stop relying on mere opinions. Well, anyways, next, friends, the halakha is crystal clear that two of the many things that man is obligated to provide for his wife is one, a kupach, or some girsot say kippah, i.e. a head covering or a cap, and two, cloth, so that she can wrap her head with. And this is clear in the halakha. Again, this is 100% binding halakha, not left up to local custom. And you can find this halakha in Chilchot Ishut Perek Yud Gimel. And do dissenting Achronim even mention this? Of course not. Now, another argument against the notion of erva, or woman's hair being erva nowadays, is mainly that because men do not consider women's hair a form of sensual nakedness, that this in some way makes the whole notion of erva also subject to the society that one happens to live in. Now, the problem with this argument is that this is a law that Chazal instituted, so only they can uninstitute it. I mean, this is Halakha 101, and again, this cannot be done without the existence of another Sanhedrin. Again, whether we physically consider it sensual or not, which is another baseless statement in itself. I mean, who is anyone to say that men do not consider women's hair attractive, unless they had another agenda up their sleeves, mainly appeasing a Jewish community or Jewish women who choose not to cover. And yes, friends, there are a lot of these. Actually, I'm a firm believer that when Chazal instituted the notion of erva into halakha, people didn't feel any differently about hair as they do nowadays, but knew that it was, as it is seen today, as the crowning jewel of a woman. I mean, take Beyonce or Julia Roberts and cover up their hair and then tell me that people won't say that some luster is lost. I mean, honestly. No, the problem with modern day rabbis is the same reason we find in the letter of Rav Mashash. Basically, just a letter condoning women not covering up, as he states in his famous letter, because women decided to stop covering up altogether. This then forced him to go out of his way to find justification for their action. But not that this was ever understood traditionally to be a halakha left up to local custom. And not to mention that this is what was practiced and how it was understood in virtually every Torah community worldwide before the turn of the century. In other words, if you look at old pictures of Jews in the Middle East or even Jews in Eastern Europe, women covered their hair, and even single women. Anyways, friends, the next portion I want to cover is who is ultimately supposed to be covering their hair. Was it just married and divorced women or single women as well? And the answer for this section, although pretty clear in the sources, is also tied into the notion of erva. Now, to really understand the notion of erva, or what is meant by it, you have to understand the way rabbinic decrees work. Now, you must also understand that rabbinic decrees, unlike Torah decrees, like we said, always have to be built off of logic. In other words, we know that although the notion of a woman covering her hair appears in Torah, it for sure does not appear as a command that one has to observe. We said this earlier, which actually sheds light on the notion mentioned in Hilchot Ishut of calling the covering of the head Dat Moshe, a law or custom deriving somehow from Moses, which is really only stated here because this was the din brought down by Rabbi Yishmael in Masechet Ketubot, Ayin Bet Amud Aleph. that a woman walking out with her head, not her hair, uncovered is considered midoraita from the Torah, but not an iser doraita, a violation of what appears in Torah, i.e. the law of Moses, which is why the Rambam correctly calls it a violation of Da'at Moshe. In other words, the head or hair coverings were never considered a mitzvah from the Torah, but just a warning from the Torah, ultimately from a custom instituted by Moses. And like virtually everything else which appears in the 5 books, we consider it inspired and sanctioned by the authority of the Almighty Himself, and of course, not necessarily something we can always explain. Unlike what was created later by the court to either make sense or translate those unchangeable mitzvot in Torah in a practical manner, i.e., what is known as rabbinic or oral law. In other words, friends, there's no interpreting the words of our fallible sages to mean something they contextually were not meant to mean. In other words, there is no shivim panim le halacha. In other words, halacha typically is only understood one way, and that's literally. And friends, that's the only method I'm utilizing in this lecture. So if erva meant X to Chazal, there's no reason to interpret it as Y to our generation. So this tells us that if hair is sensual and attractive, literally an erva for married women, why suddenly is it not considered an erva for unmarried women? I mean, again, we're still using logic. In other words, friends, I'm sure you've heard it, that only married women have to cover their hair in Judaism. So, what's true? Well, friends, what if I told you that logic has not failed us yet? Because it is clear that according to the halakha, all women, single and married, are obligated to cover their hair. And it states it very, very clearly in the halakha. In other words, this is not just my opinion. And this is not just in the Mishneh Torah, but also in the Shulchan Aruch, what everyone claims to hold by nowadays. And what? You could look it up yourself. As a matter of fact, even as early as the beginning of the 1900s, most Orthodox Jewish girls covered their hair in their communities in both the Middle East and even Europe. And even, like we said, the Shulchan Aruch and Even Chaezer reiterates this fact. And really, my friends, it can't get any clearer when it states that Jewish daughters should not go into the streets with their hair uncovered, whether they are married or single. This is exactly what it says. Ve'echad penuya ve'echad eshet ish. And you must know that the Mishneh Torah said the same, which is actually what the Maran was quoting from. Hilchot Isurei Biyah Chaf Aleph, Halacha Yud Zayin, where it states that the daughters of Israel should not walk with their heads uncovered in the marketplace. Again, both unmarried and married. And here, friends, in Isurei Biyah, it mentions nothing about Dat Yehudit or anything having to do with custom. And the reason that the Rambam's codification is so important, especially in this area, friends, is because he was the only one to ever codify all of halakha, unlike the rest of the codifiers who only codified certain sections, which would obviously force him to skip critical portions which are at least semi-related to the issue at hand. Now, the reason why current rabbis have begun to teach that unmarried women do not have to cover their hair is because they began to say that because in Hilchot Isurei Biyah, Chaf Aleph, and later in the Shulchan Aruch, it uses the term Banot Yisrael, daughters of Israel, and then it goes on to define daughters of Israel as referring to single and married women, that this means that some type of female among the daughters of Israel is being excluded, assumingly a never married female virgin. And it was as simple as that for them to abolish the halakha. In other words, they have retranslated penuya to mean unmarried women who were either gerushot or almanot, divorcees or widows. Now, I'm not sure why they had to go through such pilpul to come to this understanding when they could have just understood, because this sugya appears in Masechet Ketubah, and it's regarding a woman losing her ketubah, that this might be referring only to married women. However, they still would have to deal with the notion of erva, which is what the sugya claims it's referring to in terms of hair/head coverings, which it then seems is why the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch phrases it the way they do, as in terms of Banot Yisrael. Because again, friends, yes, looking upon erva does not discriminate, right? Either something is sexually appealing or it isn't, with the exception of reciting Shema, when the halakha is that you could recite Shema in front of a virgin with her hair uncovered, but not in front of a non-virgin. But this does not mean that her hair is not an erva, but just that in one's home you're most likely to find younger girls who are less careful than older, possibly married women. So Chazal didn't want to make it impossible for someone to pray. But the biggest, most obvious argument in terms of single women having to cover their hair is, like we said, that erva regarding hair was instituted because of the sensual attractiveness of hair. So what, are we to assume that the hair of single girls are not considered sensually appealing, but only later magically become so after that woman marries? Because, friends, you must understand that Chazal didn't have Nevuah, that rabbinic concepts don't deal with the magical or metaphysical, but the practical. And again, friends, you have to realize that all this is only said about the veil, the radid, the hair covering, not the head covering, which, like we said, is also considered 100% binding. And not to mention that there is no distinction made between single or married women regarding the head covering, the mitpachat, what, again, is considered dat Moshe from the Torah. Another aspect that modern rabbis ignore completely. In other words, if they're going to say that dat Yehudit is regulated only by local custom, what do about dat Moshe, the mitpachat, the tichel, what some even equate to the kupach, the head covering that a man is obligated to give his wife when he marries her, or even the fabric he gives her for her to wrap her hair? And as a matter of fact, because they ruled that single women don't have to cover their hair, because of this ruling, they were later forced to completely violate their own interpretation by saying that divorcees and widows shouldn't cover up either. Why? Well, like Rabbi Moshe ruled that because now it became a hindrance for shidduchim, for a divorcee or a widow to find a new spouse, because everyone understands nowadays that girls who are single do not cover their hair. So if these divorcees or widows would follow the halakha, they wouldn't be considered single by men in their community. Do you see what happens when we violate one halakha? Down the road, we end up violating many, many more. And in this lecture, I'm not even going into how this covering, known by the Rambam as the radid, which again falls under dat Yehudit, is really where the modern day Islamic hijab was derived from, which, yes, covers the neck, what the radid is said to cover. Actually, if someone wants a quick guide of what a woman's headdress should look like in terms of a head/hair covering, you could always download our free Siddur, which has nice illustrated images backed up with sources to guide you. Now, before I end this lecture, I want to talk about shaitels quickly, wigs. And honestly, I think that many of you will be surprised about what I have to say on the issue. Now, many people attack shaitels, and this is probably going to be my major chidush in this lecture, mainly because I actually take a different understanding to wigs in our day and age. Now, for people who take the approach that hair is not necessarily an erva nowadays, which is not an approach I completely disagree with. I mean, who really knows if Chazal themselves would have agreed or not? In other words, for people who are on this basis, who would otherwise choose not to cover at all, in my opinion, they then should consider getting a sheitel instead. Why? Well, first on the principle of safek derabanan lehakel, that if there's a question on a rabbinic decree, we are lenient. Now, lenient doesn't mean that we abolish it like many have done today, but I think that sheitelach might be a good compromise, which, by the way, covers both the head and the hair. However, it doesn't do much for erva, but as the Lubavitcher Rebbe stated, it's better than nothing. And with all the social pressures women have today not to cover up, it may be a good compromise. And friends, you're probably wondering, how is a woman supposed to cover her hair according to Jewish law? And I would say that anything that covers your hair completely should be fine. Now, there's a new understanding out there that allows for up to a tefach of a woman's hair to be shown, but know that this is not an idea endorsed by classic halakha. But if you want to get technical, at least according to the Rambam and the Mishnah, and even the Shulchan Aruch and the Bir Halacha regarding a mitpachat and a redid, the kupach, as mentioned in Hilchot Yishud Perik Yud Gimel, is a cap for the head that may or may not cover all of the hair. And the mitpachat, the tichel, covers all of the hair and the head. And some actually equate this with the kupach itself, saying that it might be the same article. And then the radid, the veil, covers all of these and actually extends down and wraps around the neck. And you would actually be surprised to know that it is virtually identical to the layers that Islamic women used to cover up, mainly because Islam adopted its laws of modesty from Talmudic Judaism itself. Now, I know that all this may seem a bit complicated, so I think I'm just going to stop here. And friends, everything we covered today is everything halachic regarding hair coverings. And if you hear other mystical reasons to cover, know that they have nothing to do with Jewish law and really should never be confused as such. Not saying that they are necessarily wrong, but just should be viewed as a non-binding spiritual devotional understanding of the practice rather than something that the Almighty Himself will judge you for. Okay? So for more information on everything Jewish, friends, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.